Well, welcome back, everyone, to the third of three seminars that we're running this semester, exploring aspects of artificial intelligence in relation to the social contract and the common good. First of all, we heard from Jeff Keeling from Google Research, who spoke on the subject emerging questions in AI welfare. And then we heard from Simon Angus on inclusive economics. How could AI technologies shape a new inclusive economy? And today it is my absolute delight to welcome a colleague of mine from Monash University, Professor Robert Sparrow, Professor of Philosophy. Say a couple of words about Rob's broader work. His work focuses on the ethical implications of adopting new technologies, ranging all the way from artificial intelligence to genetic engineering, with an emphasis on formulating ethical arguments that contribute to public and political debate. He's also an associate investigator at the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society, and he's listed as a chief investigator at the ARC Centre of Excellence for Electromaterial Science. Ever since I've known Rob, must be many years on and off now, he's always been working on the frontier of the sorts of questions that we're going to be discussing this evening, and therefore I'm particularly delighted and looking forward with great expectation to what he has to share with us in this session. And his title for this session is Slaves to the Algorithms, Algocracy and Republican Liberty. So please do join with me in welcoming our speaker for this session, Professor Robert Sparrow.
Always hard to know what to do when people clap online, isn't it? Thanks for that kind introduction, Chris, and for making available this opportunity. It's nice to get a sense of encountering a new community, a new scholarly community, which I can see this network is creating. Today's talk, I hope, is very much on topic to the theme that you've described. I am working across a range of applications of AI. At the moment, I've done a lot of work on military robotics and now military uses of AI, doing some work on medical AI, some work on kind of digital companions, but all of my work is concerned with a question of how we should respond to what appear to be claims made by machines. We've all had this experience now where machines really seem to be speaking to us in our own language. They're very sort of erudite nowadays, often quite informative, and yet the status of the claims that they make is really hard to work out because they are deeply alien beings. In some sense, they don't mean anything that they say. They're not connected to the world and they don't stand behind their words. So there's, for all sorts of reasons, the status of the outputs of AI poses a really interesting set of political questions. And of course, one way of thinking about these is just saying, what if we put the machines in charge of government? What would that mean for us? And so this talk is a investigation of what John Danaher refers to as algocracy, which is essentially government by AI. I'll share the slides now, not least because I've got a cool picture of Grace Jones that I I like. Let's see what's happening here. All right, so that's the title slide, although I'm described there as being associated with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society. I'm only an associate investigator. My main affiliation is with the philosophy department here at Monash University. Okay, so algocracy is, there's a definition there. It's colloquially, I'm going to talk about government by AI, but the official story is that it's actually the use of algorithms in government. And that is quite important because, for a number of reasons, in part, it connects this talk to the sort of long-standing Frankfurt School critical theory engagement with technocracy and sort of um, technocratic rationality in government. There's a long history of governments using algorithms, but those algorithms might have been instantiated in relationships between officials or in the forms that you filled out. Um, and so I want to see this sort of new move to um, instantiate algorithms in AI systems as essentially continuous with this longer history. In part, I want to do that because it holds open the possibility that algorithmic government might be compatible with Republican liberty, because there's this long history of governments using algorithms, and I guess we don't typically think that we became slaves to the algorithms when people started filling in, paper cards. So there's um, talking about Algocracy, uh, there's an engagement with Pettit's neo-republicanism, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, and an engagement with an argument that John Danaher made, where he argued that black box AI that people essentially can't understand, or you can't look inside and analyze the so-called reasons for its decision, is a threat to legitimacy. And I'm trying to um, expand on or strengthen that argument and argue that there's actually a threat to liberty here. But that's very much a quick and dirty overview of the paper, and hopefully it'll all become a bit clearer uh, in a moment. My kind of take-home message is that there are, in fact, three threats to liberty from algocracy. One arises because it's predictable that the use of these machines will make it effectively impossible for people to contest. I think the decision to use AI is actually the relevant decision here, but that's a part of the discussion, is whether what you need to contest is the decisions made on the basis of the outputs of AI or the decision to use AI. Then there's an independent argument that says, look, AI is likely to be deeply corrosive of important civic and democratic virtues. And a third set of arguments that are just kind of concerns about the possibility that AI will effectively render governments sort of immune to popular revolution. And as a result of that, they won't need to govern in the interests of their citizens, or they won't govern in the right way for a Republican to think that the citizenry are free. So again, that's the overview. Hopefully, there's some detail coming in a moment. All right, so here's the definition of algocracy. Again, the images are supposed to communicate this kind of sense that there is a longer history of bureaucratic government and of criticisms of technocratic rationality lurking around here. It is important to recognize that I'm not requiring that there's no human involvement in a government decision in order for it to count as algocracy. If people are rubber stamping the decisions of machines, then I think that there's effectively algocracy. If the information that people use to make their decisions is provided to them by machines, then that will also count as algocracy uh, on this definition. So it's quite an expansive definition uh, of what it means for AI or algorithms to be playing an essential role in government, such that you might think that we are in some sense uh, vulnerable to the decisions that colloquially are being made by machines. Uh, I am, there's lots of reasons to be concerned about the use the use of AI to make government decisions. Some people simply think that AI can't make certain sorts of decisions. I mean, I do think people, there was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, people would confidently tell you that, ChatGPT couldn't talk about emotions or couldn't talk about its personal experience. As we have become more familiar with those systems, we're much less confident about what machines can and can't do. There is this sort of long history of philosophers saying machines will never be able to do this. Engineers basically ignoring the philosophers and going ahead and actually doing it. So I'm not trying to make an argument here about what computers can't do. I'm also not talking about bias, and I'm not talking about limitations on the kind of modes of reasoning available to AI. There's a certain group of critics who will tell you that AI is good at some things, but there are particular important um, cognitive skills of synthesis or drawing conclusions from limited data that it can't achieve. I actually think those are all really important criticisms, particularly the kind of the worries about bias and reinforcing bias. I think they are really important reasons to not use AI in government, but I'm just ignoring them now. That's not the argument that I'm trying to develop here. My argument is premised on the idea that machines actually might be better than human beings at government. And there's a very clear kind of if you got bad results from using machines in government, you shouldn't do it for fairly straightforward, pragmatic reasons. I mean, there are some kind of, sometimes people in power actually prefer decision systems that make poor decisions if it obscures their own kind of class position. But I want to kind of drink the Kool-Aid of algorithmic government and imagine the possibility that these machines will be better than human in in their performance in crucial roles. This does, of course, presume that we've got a metric of knowing how we would tell whether machines were making better decisions than human beings. But in some contexts, particularly where you're predicting something, that's actually reasonably straightforward. And we should all be aware now that machines genuinely are better at doing a whole lot of stuff than human beings are now. So they outperform us, on multiple metrics, particularly in, speed of calculation and mathematics and processing large data sets, all of which is relevant to government decisions. So it seems to me quite plausible that machines might actually be better at fulfilling certain government functions than human beings would be. But this argument is supposed to say, even if that were true, we might have reasons to resile from their use. So the way I'm going to make that argument is by drawing on the kind of political philosophy of republicanism, because one of the central kind of intuitions of the Republican tradition is that government by a benevolent dictator is still a dictatorship, and you may be unfree even if you live in a kind of gilded cage, even if in fact the government doesn't oppress you or infringe on your kind of empirical liberty, the fact that they have the power to do so, that they could squash you like a bug if they wanted to, means that in some sense you're fundamentally unfree. And that moment in the Republican tradition, that sort of criticism of the benevolent dictator, means that it's especially well suited to criticizing a mode of government that I've just allowed might actually, in some sense, be better than human. So, another way of thinking about the Republican tradition is to think about the state, a well-functioning state, a well-organized state, as being a condition of liberty rather than a threat to liberty. So unlike aspects of the liberal tradition, which thinks that governmental power is itself inimical to, like fundamentally, deeply inimical to freedom, the power that other people have is necessarily inimical to freedom. The Republican tradition doesn't believe that. The Republican tradition has this really nice way of reconciling the power of government with the liberty of citizens through the idea of the rule of law, and that in a well-ordered republic, the exercise of government power is guided by the interests of the citizens as expressed themselves. So you reconcile liberty and authority in a really neat way. The danger, according to Republicans, though, is that governments that aren't political orders that aren't well organized will involve domination. And domination is what renders us unfree on the Republican account. Now, it's important to understand here that domination on the Republican account is a structural relationship. And someone who dominates you need not actually exercise this power in order for you to be unfree. Okay, so again, you think of a benevolent and yet authoritarian government doesn't in fact interfere in the day-to-day activities of its citizens, but could if it wanted to. And the fact that it could if it wanted to means that on the Republican account, the citizens are unfree because they are dominated. So here's the definition of domination according to Pettit. So domination it's a capacity. It arises out of the capacity to interfere on an arbitrary basis and in choices that you might legitimately be able to make. It will become important to my argument in a moment to note that on Pettit's account, interference requires an intentional setback to the interests of others. So just because my actions affect you, that isn't sufficient for it to count as interference. Okay, so if I, get to the supermarket first and buy the last grapefruit, that interferes with your plans to eat a grapefruit, but it won't count as interference unless I was doing it deliberately to thwart you. So there's a role play by intention. Yeah. All right. Now we noticed in the previous slide that there was a reference to arbitrariness, and this is this is important here because, of course, on a Republican account, the government is going to interfere with the plans of citizens. Like the rule of law structures our interactions. It stops us from, um, you know, attacking each other or oppressing each other in various ways. So the government does actually interfere with things that citizens are doing when it governs, but it doesn't, well, it shouldn't, according to Republicans, if uh, 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 it shouldn't do it in a way that is arbitrary, I guess is what I'm trying to say. All right. So, we have the quote here is pretty clear that arbitrariness is kind of an unconstrained will. So if someone has the power, Pettit talks a lot about, women who live in fear of their husbands. Their husbands don't, in fact, beat them or, constrain them at all, but the woman knows that her husband has a terrible temper, could in fact behave violently towards her, and so uh, tippy toes around because of the power, the arbitrary power possessed by this, oppressive patriarch. Um, but in order to reconcile the power of government with the liberty of citizens, there's this caveat that if interference is required to track someone's interests according to their own judgments, then it doesn't count as arbitrary. Laws that reflect the popular will that people have chosen to live under don't count as arbitrary. Um, all right, so here's some other expressions of this central Republican intuition about freedom as non-domination. And I'm going to be emphasizing two things here. One is that um, the popular will, as it were, or the kind of the interests of citizens must be uh, they can't simply be assumed by the government. They must be expressed by citizens themselves. And the government must be required, in some sense, required to track the interests or to track the interests of citizens means that the government must be actually constrained by those interests. It cannot simply be that the government does what citizens want. It must be that the government does what citizens want because citizens want it, or because in some sense they can't do anything else. But Pettit allows this, and this is caveat in Pettit, allows that this could be this expression of interests can occur at the procedural level rather than at the substantive level. So you have a set of political institutions that if that does what it's supposed to, and government is required to track the outcomes of those institutions, it need not matter that citizens were actually sort of substantively involved, I guess, is there's a weak theory of political participation in the background here, I guess is another way of putting it. So there's quite a bit of, I'm getting quite a lot of the sort of architecture of republicanism out of the way, because the argument is going to later in the paper is going to turn crucially on some of these claims. Hopefully you will see that in a moment. All right. So John Danaher in this 2016 paper makes a criticism of algocracy as a threat to legitimacy. Now, legitimacy and liberty are quite different things. So Danaher's argument basically says, look, if we don't understand why government is doing the things that it does, people simply say, well, an AI told us to. The reason why you've been, your housing loan has been denied, or you have been selected by the tax office for extra investigation is simply this kind of black box told us to do it, then those decisions won't be explainable to the public and they won't be legitimate. But I think that's low-hanging fruit here. I think that argument follows quite straightforwardly. The argument that I'm interested in, that algocracy might be a threat to liberty, is a much stronger claim, and not one. I mean, Danaher mentions it in subsequent work, but to my knowledge, has not developed this argument. All right. So the obvious move to make is simply to criticize algorithms themselves as being arbitrary, that they are not connected to the interests of citizens in the right way. So this is just a sort of straight transposition of the claim about black boxes in government, that the role played by black boxes in government decision making not only threatens legitimacy, but actually makes it impossible for people to contest the decisions, which means that they don't track their interests in the right way, which means that they will count as arbitrary decisions on Pettit's account. Now, in some ways, I want to be upfront here. I think that argument is actually too swift. Okay, I think it's tempting to make that argument, to say that the mere fact that the processes of government once the processes of government are just handed over to AI, that we won't understand why it's doing what it's doing, and it's not responsive to our ways of thinking, and we can't argue with its reasons because we don't know what its reasons are. That all sounds like it establishes that algorithmic decision making would be arbitrary and therefore dominating, but I think that in fact is a mistake for reasons that I will get to in a moment. Okay, so the first reason why that's too swift is to go back to Pettit's observation about procedural justification for the actions of government. And it actually seems to me like that there is, in a sense, a reason that government could give you for employing an algorithm, which is simply that they say that it will make a better decision. We don't know why it's doing what it's doing, but we know that what it's doing is good for us. Now, there's an analogous debate in medical ethics about the use of AI in medicine. People say government, doctors shouldn't rely on systems that they don't understand. The tech companies say, but hang on, my machine can diagnose your cancer better than any human being. the doctors, people say, but the doctor doesn't understand it. And then people simply point out that uh, there's huge chunks of medicine where people have relied for, decades, sometimes, more than a century on treatments that we don't understand the mechanism thereof. Okay, so, you know, how does aspirin work? How do antidepressants work? Nobody, in fact, knows, but we know that they do work. And in the same way, you might say, look, I don't know what the machine's doing, but I know that it's you'll get a better outcome uh, from using it. So that is a form of procedural justification. Um, but the problem here is whether that argument, the uh, is one that we ourselves are going to be able to contest. Okay, so someone says this machine gets things right more than human beings do. I acknowledge that that is uh, a good justification for resorting to algocracy, but the question is how open is that justification itself to contestation by citizens? And the worry is that for a whole series of reasons, the use of machines allows governments simply to wave their hands at that level and makes it just very hard for the citizenry to assess the claims that are being made about the virtues of the machine. Um, but to step back a bit, you might think that the problem here is the machines having power over us, but uh, as I've been arguing just then, the real issue is the power of the people who make the decisions to use AI. So even though I've got slaves to the algorithms in the title, the conclusion of the paper is not that we are or might be slaves to the algorithms, but rather we might be enslaved, dominated by, subjugated by the people who are making the decision to employ the algorithms. Uh, so now, with that worry in mind, just to return to this question of, well, how might decisions about to resort to algorithms be justified? In some cases, algorithmic decision making might have what's called pure procedural virtues. So the example here is a lottery. There's a sense in which a lottery is a fair mechanism for um, distributing scarce resources. But if someone wins and someone loses, i.e. their number gets pulled out of a hat and they get a bundle of resources, in one sense, there's no justification, and another there is. So you've got a procedural virtue to that decision making. You might, again, make this argument that they simply do better. They're more reliable than human beings if we have an independent metric for checking that. And certainly in lots of areas we do. And there are pragmatic virtues to machine decision making. It's fast, it's cheap, can be rolled out very quickly. The picture there is of a kind of computer-controlled cannon that is used to shoot down incoming cruise missiles, or actually even shells, mortar shells nowadays. And it's not perfect, but what it's doing is something that no human being can do. So there's a sense in which there's a very straightforward, pragmatic justification for handing over control of that weapon to a machine, which is that it works, and the human being can't do it. So these are all possible methods of justifying the resort to algorithmic government. But the question is, how effectively can we contest the arguments being made at that level? And there, I think the answer is not very well. Um, I'm a bit concerned about timing, so I'm going to go through some of this quite quickly now because but essentially the worry here is that uh, it's very hard for the public to evaluate claims that are made about the virtues of algorithmic decision making. You don't know who's designed the machine, what they've built into it. You don't know, even if you think that it is generally reliable, you don't know whether it's working in this particular case. So that's a problem with the argument about reliability or even procedural virtue is, of course, there's always a chance that look, it's generally reliable, but in this particular subset of cases, it stopped working or it doesn't working. And that is very, very hard to challenge. Sometimes these things look straightforwardly contrary to natural justice, such that you might want to contest, you just say this cannot be right, and you want to contest it on that basis. But the fact that these things are effectively black boxes makes that all very, very difficult. Again, it's important to acknowledge that what is, even though it's tempting to describe this as contesting the decision of the machine, the appropriate description is contesting the decision to rely upon the outputs of the machine in this particular case. So I'm pushing the argument back to the human decision to defer to algorithmic decision making in not just in general, but in each particular interest. All right, so there's a possibility here, it seems to me. I want to leave this argument behind to get on to two others that I'll go through pretty quickly. But I do want to leave this open. I want to say, okay, there's a genuine question here, which is, can we effectively contest and force the government to pay attention to our own accounts of our own interests when it comes to the decision to rely upon an algorithm in a particular context? And that doesn't seem to be impossible, but in practice, it seems to me increasingly difficult that governments simply hide behind these systems in ways that makes effective political contestation very, very difficult. Okay, the next two arguments are much easier, and so I will go through them more briefly. So one is simply to point out that, in this imaginary world where machines are making or facilitating better decisions than human beings generally do, people are going to get used to going along with it. There's a kind of replacement of politics by administration in this scenario. And we're already seeing, well, I'm certainly seeing in my students, a kind of radical cognitive de-skilling associated with the use of AI. People simply stop paying attention to systems that mostly work. So when it comes time to say, hang on, we want to contest this, it seems to me that people may simply have lost the political skills required to do that. So there's a kind of de-skilling in the de-skilling of people in relation to their ability to participate in politics that is facilitated by the fact that this stuff mostly works. And this is a general problem with AI, actually. It's why driverless vehicles aren't more prevalent than they already are, which is essentially people stop paying attention when the car can mostly drive itself. And then when the system fails, which it does in rare circumstances, nobody's ready and waiting to take the wheel. So most people now, when they're using a sort of driver assist system, it is constantly telling you that you must pay attention, even though it's basically driving itself. And there's real tension there because what we want from these systems, I want my car to drive itself so I can get drunk or go to sleep or read a book. But then when it does go beep, 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 beyond my parameters, I simply can't drive anymore, or I'm drunk or asleep. And there's an equivalent thing that you could imagine happening with our capacity to be involved in politics. All right. And then this is where this is just kind of, you go all QAnon here, or, I mean, not quite QAnon, but you simply look at this set of technologies that AI is offering governments, and particularly the potential for mass domestic surveillance associated with AI. Read every email, every phone call, track everyone everywhere. There's been some really spectacular stuff come out about how in the initial wave of Israeli attacks on Iran, which were designed to decapitate the government, they had hacked their entire traffic camera system and were using face recognition software to track individuals around Tehran in order to be able to kill them. And that capacity for a government to really just watch everything all the time, which people have been kind of paranoid about for decades, actually seems realistically available nowadays. But that means that the power of government is effectively unconstrained, because in the Republican tradition, the threat of popular revolt is what constrains government. So all the checks and balances, all the rule of law, all the separation of powers presupposes that citizens will act up if the government ignores it. And we're kind of seeing this in the US at the moment. We're seeing just ignoring the opinions of the courts, ignoring, traditional understandings of the separation of powers. And the administration is getting away with it because the citizenry is not capable of preventing them. So a world in which you can essentially know everyone who is going to be a critic of the government, anyone who might become a revolutionary because you're reading everything that they write, every website that they look at, is a world in which governments might become completely immune to popular uprising, which would be very bad on a Republican account. So there's a set of, suggestions about which I'm not very confident. Okay, this is, to be frank, I think this is quite lame. The more I think about this, the more I think these are not up to the task of preserving liberty against, AI-enhanced government. But that's the kind of, that's the story. You try to make it possible for people to contest the decision to trust the outputs of machines. You try to, fund an active citizenry. You try to not develop systems of mass technological surveillance. But ultimately, I'm quite pessimistic. I really think that this technology is a profound threat to liberty. And if you wanted to read some more of my work, there it is. Anyway, so I hope that sort of timing of this talk is quite difficult. It's a lot of setup. It's quite a long argument. Hope people got something from that, and I look forward to your questions and remarks.
Wonderful. Thank you ever so much, Rob. I'm sure there are many questions and remarks. If I could just remind people or let people know for whom this is your first time with us, that the way that we do questions here is that if you do have a question or a comment that you'd like to make, if you could please put a little note in the chat, and I will call on people in the order that those notes appear in the chat, just so that there's no ambiguity about who asked first and so forth. And while people are gathering their thoughts and considering what they might want to ask, I wonder, Rob, if I could ask the first question. I'm not completely sure about this question, but I think there might be something interesting to say in response to it. So I'm going to give it a go and see whether you agree. It, is it the case, would you say, that one of the threats among many that there may be to algorithmic government is that, at least in people's perceptions, if not in reality, it, the danger is that it's actually too good. Bracketing for a moment what we actually mean by good, assuming that there's some sort of measure that most people can agree to. In other words, it makes or could potentially make popular decisions uncontestable. So there's a generation of AI that can out-argue everyone immediately all the time and can best any other argument and can defend its decisions in ways that nobody can contest. Uh, and what I'm trying to think is, what would that do to the social contract? And would it not transition it from being a public act of, mutual authorization to just a process of technical optimization? I think this is an argument that you made in your paper. And so the upshot of that would be, is one thing that is vital to Republican liberty and to our way of life as we have it at the moment, that the idea of contestability, that the decisions that are made have to be both de facto and de jure contestable in order for societies such as we understand them and live in them at the moment to function. And one threat of AI is a threat to the contestability of decisions, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Um, so I agree with the second part, but not the first part. So I certainly think that contestability is absolutely uh, key here. But it's important to understand that contestability on the kind of Republican account, and there is a genuine, it seems to me, equivocation here within, like, at least Pettit's republicanism, because the emphasis on the sort of rule of law and procedural virtue uh, does see, for instance, argument in the courts, like judicial decisions as being reflective of the public will and part of the process of whereby um, you know government decisions are contested. So there is a kind of argumentative moment, but there's also this idea of being forced to track, where being forced to track is that is a relationship of power. It's not just like for a decision to be contestable, it's not just that we must be able to argue with it, but we must also be able to prevent the government from acting as it wishes uh, if we decide that it got it wrong. For instance. Now, I mean, I think AI is a threat to both of those. Okay, I mean, I do think it legitimizes, like it makes a certain form of totalitarianism really realistically available. I don't think we're quite there yet, but you can see how um, a government that wanted to now could really just identify political threats, ahead of time, uh, shut down the internet when it likes, discredit people in various ways. I mean, all of this stuff is being kind of trialed at the moment. So there's a problem here for the politics, for the sort of the power of contestation. But um, there's an important caveat when it comes to the practices of reason giving. And that's kind of not actually in the argument that I've made, but I don't think the machines genuinely give reasons.
Okay.
Okay, I think they give things that appear to be reasons.
Mm.
And my again, my reason for thinking that is beyond this paper, but it's essentially the fact that the machines don't, one way of saying they don't have skin in the game in our practices of reason giving, or they can't be held responsible for what they say. Okay, so if you tell me something, I have it on your authority, uh, that that thing. You can give me a reason, but there's a cost involved to you if you're bullshitting me or you're lying to me or you're trying to manipulate me. There's none of that for the machines because they don't have the right kind of bodies. There's not, we're not going to jail the machines. We're not going to, they don't stand to gain or lose anything in the conversations that we have with
Yeah.
them, which means that I think that what they're doing, even though they appear to be providing us with reasons, it's fundamentally not. And you can kind of actually, it's all confabulation coming from the machine. So they're kind of, elsewhere I've argued that this is Frankfurtian bullshit,
Yes.
where Frankfurt talks about bullshit as being discourse that is only concerned with audience response and not with the truth. So Frankfurt says, look, ordinarily people tell the truth because they care about the truth. Liars care about the truth and they're trying to turn you away from it. The bullshitter just wants to get a rise out of you or convince you of something and will say whatever it takes. The machines are fundamentally bullshitters
Mm.
in that sense because what they want from you is a little thumbs up. They want you to, they want you to kind of um, uh, responds to what they say in a certain way. They don't care about the truth. They can't care about the truth. So for me, that means that they're not capable of doing what, say, High Court justices are capable of doing. But again, that argument is all sort of beyond this paper. The reasons why I think the machines will make it harder for people to contest at the level of reason is I think that we will just fall out of practice.
Oh,
Okay. So, if like, so again, go to the sort of driverless vehicle analogy.
sure.
Okay. One of the worries, one of the worries with driverless vehicles that work 99.99% of the time is that people simply stop paying attention to the driving task. So when it fails, it's catastrophic. Uh, what at the moment, what's required is we're supposed to all pay attention, waiting for the moment when when um, the assisted steering turns off, for instance, and then you're supposed to take control. But as these systems get better, people simply won't learn to drive at all. You just like I imagine my daughters, there's a chance that by the time they're sort of getting into cars, there's no steering wheels,
Mm.
or they spend so little time actively in control of the vehicle that they simply won't be able to drive. In the same way, if you are used to a bureaucratic system getting things right most of the time, you simply run out of you know, you just don't have the skills of democratic contestation that people need. So I think there is a real risk of, um, yeah, sort of um, de-skilling of the citizenry
Yeah.
in ways that makes contestation impossible. So that's a long answer to that question. But contestability is itself quite a complicated notion.
No, absolutely. And it's such a helpful clarification. So what I'm taking from that is that you've got to have the will to contest, you've got to have the capacity to contest, and the system
Yes.
has to allow you a space within which you can contest. So that, yeah, there's not one thing called contest, but that's incredibly helpful. Thank you. Joanne has a question. Joanne, could I invite you to ask your question?
Thank you very much. Great talk. I'm just more worried about the use of algorithm. Okay. We've got algorithms that we can unpack and trace.
Machines don't
For
like this.
example, we're using Bayes' theorem to do parent in some ways. And then we have LLMs and other kinds. We can unpack other kinds of AI, but a different sort of machine in which we train it, and God knows what the different connections will come up with, but it may be hallucination, it may not. Again, I'm not just looking at how reliable a machine can be, but whether or not we can, in a transparent way, unpack what's going on, whether or not the developer on a witness stand can say, yes, I programmed it to take these inputs, and in the way I describe, which it would take some expertise to understand, this output occurs from what's happening now, which is we're taking all these data and it comes out with that output. So again, perhaps we'll have to come up with another name than Algocracy or whatever at some point. I'm sure we will, to refer to the black boxes, to the kinds of black boxes that we train, rather than the kind that are set up to be transparent. So again, great talk. I have one more question, but I'll wait it until later. Thank you so much.
No worries. All right. So look, I mean that is an interesting question for me because uh, I don't, for me, it doesn't matter whether because I'm interested in the possibility that justification occurs at the procedural level. I mean, this like doesn't actually matter to me in many contexts, whether they're black boxes or not. Okay, so I think you can be justified in um, acting on the basis of an output of a black box. It doesn't matter to me that people don't know what happens inside the machine. It, because I'm convinced by this
Mm.
analogy in the medical context where people say, look, we don't know how antidepressants work. All that stuff about, elevating the rate of serotonin in your brain turns out to be bullshit. Nobody knows how the kind of Zoloft and the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. There's a whole class of drugs here. We know that they work, but we don't know how. But the fact that we know that they work is a good justification for prescribing them. Now, I mean, in fact, there's a bit of contestation in the detail there, but there's certainly lots of medical treatments, particularly pharmaceuticals, that people don't understand the mechanism. They're effectively black boxes, but the justification is pragmatic. These things work. And so I'm happy to accept the possibility that someone might say, you want a justification for why we have deferred to this machine, which we don't understand and we can't look inside. Well, the justification is that we know on the basis of the historical record that we get better outcomes from that than we do from the alternative ways we could have making that decision. So I'm okay with the black boxes, but you're absolutely right that maybe that means that algocracy is the wrong term there. That in a sense I'm more concerned with government by machine than I am with government by algorithm. Uh, in part, that's just a historical artifact with starting with this Danaher paper, who and the 2016 probably just before the sort of breakthroughs in uh, convolutional neural networks that are driving the chat box. Yeah. So I mean, I think if pushed, I would give up on the term algocracy. I'm not sure what I'd replace it with. But the rest of the argument, I think, stands because I certainly had those systems in mind when I was thinking about how someone might justify um, acting on the basis of the outputs of a machine that we don't, in fact, know how it works.
Wonderful. Thank
I'm
you.
worried now that we are discussing, we as a discipline are discussing AIs in such a way that it doesn't make those distinctions, doesn't look at least a little bit within the black box. I always had the analogy of the designer on the witness stand. I mean, I'm a professional developer myself, and you know, can I explain, to what extent can I explain this? How this machine works to a jury, and whether or not I did take race into account. We can't
Right.
tell whether or not the LLM took race into account. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay. But so I just want to insist that I'm open to the possibility that someone says just upfront, I don't know how this works, but my justification for using it is that it works. As long as we have standards that enable us to tell whether it works or not. And in some contexts, we can. Now, absolutely, there are those questions about uh, might it be relying upon data that we think is inappropriate for, rate information? Might it be taking race into account for reasons that, um, uh, where we wouldn't accept a human being doing so? But even there, it seems to me that you can look at the performance of the algorithm uh, and develop a justification for its use that can tell us something about even its sort of racial politics or its gender politics without knowing how it works. Or at least I want to hold that possibility open.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rob. Lauren has a question. Lauren, could I invite you to ask yours? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. That was really, really interesting. I just want to talk about, you're talking about cognitive de-skilling. And my point's sort of similar to that. Something I'm worried about as I write on these issues as well is that, you know, with a more widespread usage of ChatGPT and other similar LLMs and AI models, that not only are people perhaps cognitively de-skilling in that they lose the ability to reason for themselves, but they also in some way offload that reasoning or they internalize that reasoning from these models themselves because they trust their, you know, reliability or something like that. And so instead of going like, oh, you know, it saves me from having to make these calculations or do Google searches myself, it's also like, well, they're right. And that's why I should defer my reasoning to them. And then people start to begin to internalize these AI models' reasoning. And so what I'm concerned about is that not only is it there's no ability to contest on the basis of like they just don't have the skills, but more so that we begin to internalize these AI values and this AI reasoning and begin to think that that is correct. So I'm just wondering your thoughts about, you know, the possibility of internalizing and turning like, you know, sort of human reasoning and then our own cognitive systems becoming more aligned with AI and how that affects our ability to contest the systems being put into place.
Um, so look, again, I just want to I want to insist that in some contexts it is absolutely the right thing to do to defer to a machine. Okay, and this is so think about something as simple as a fire alarm, for instance. So, okay, that is capable of detecting levels of smoke in the atmosphere that I can't smell a fire, I can't see a fire, but the fire alarm is going off. Uh, I may have good reasons to act, you know, if it turns out that these things are reliable at detecting fire, then I should simply defer to it. So, I don't want to rule out that in fact is an appropriate response to the presence of machines that outperform us in various ways. That's by no means the end of that conversation. Like sometimes, for instance, there are reasons to you know insist on maintaining a skill that isn't in fact necessary, strictly necessary. In fact, there is a kind of uh there's an alternative technological solution that outperforms human being, but you insist on retaining that skill because it's, say, internal to what it means to be an agent, or it's expressive of a virtue, or it establishes certain sorts of political relations but between people. So there are other reasons for pushing back against this form of sort of cognitive offloading. But I also want to insist that sometimes someone who insists on working it out themselves is doing something that is actually irrational. Uh, yeah, so I don't know if I was trying to we'll work out whether or not something was a prime number or not. That is not something that I'm going to laboriously do on myself. I'm simply going to defer to a machine. Yeah, so I mean, I do, I personally have a sort of fear here about people losing the capacity for agency at all. I see my students, answering the question, why did you choose to take this course? By getting the answer off their phone. You think there is something really disturbing about that. But if, I don't know, in some contexts, Google Maps is absolutely the right way, right way to go because they have access to data that you don't have.
Thank you.
Lauren, do you have a follow-up on that specific question, or are you good?
Thank you. I guess the sort of what I'm thinking about is David Beer has this idea of the recursive society, and that as algorithms become more widespread, we sort of take on this similar recursive mindset that algorithms have. And so, yeah, I'm just worried about how, like you were saying, how that might affect our ability to be agents and how that might affect our agency and our ability to make informed decisions about, things that are to do with our civic liberties.
Look, it is a mistake to understand ourselves as being machines. Like that is like that sort of, we always understand ourselves using metaphors derived from our state-of-the-art technology. And so, we used to talk about people getting wound up because, clocks were the best technology. And, then we talked about their steam, steam blowing out of their ears because steam engines were good. And, now we talk about, I had a bit of a brain crash or freeze or like that. That process is a sort of dangerous and dehumanizing one. And there are, again, there are analogies at the communal level as well. I just think that we should be really cautious about denying that these systems might, in fact, make better decisions than people could make, and denying that where that can be established, we might be justified in using them, even if we don't know how they're making the decision. So I just think there's a danger here that people in the humanities have this sort of damn thing will never work attitude towards technology, and that the arguments that people need to make to resist this stuff, and there is all sorts of reasons to resist it, shouldn't be premised on naive claims uh, about what the technology might make possible. It seems to me like there clearly are ways now in which the machines outperform me, and the appropriate response to that is to defer to them. And then there are some maybe there are particular cases where you shouldn't do that, but that needs to be argued at a different level.
Yeah, so you're taking a more sort of balanced approach to this sort of AI argument that, like, in some cases we can justify its usage, and so therefore it must be therefore we can use it, but in some circumstances perhaps we need to question its justifiability, if I'm
Yeah,
understanding correctly.
well, yes, in particular, when someone says this thing works, this like that, so it's definitely possible that these systems can outperform human beings at important tasks.
Mhm.
But most of the time, people say they do. That turns out to be wrong. Okay, so I want to hold open the conceptual possibility that these things are better. Like holding the roof up, you want a steel girder, not like some strong dude holding the roof up. Okay, the tech is better than human. But when people make these claims for AI systems, and they simply say, "Oh, my machine outperforms your human being," um, like certainly in the medical context where I'm most familiar with that claim, when you look at the detail, uh, the basis for that claim is really dodgy. Okay, almost no one does, for instance, real-world clinical trials of this tech, and there's all sorts, people simply they do this very artificial, train it on half the data set, unleash it on the other half and say, look, it does better, better than human performance. No one actually ever puts it into practice and sees whether it works and whether it generates real benefits for people. Which is to say, you should be really suspicious. Like it's certainly possible that this stuff is going to outperform human beings, but in a lot of contexts, when people make that claim, it's not true. And as Joanne pointed out, there's all sorts of other things that might be going on that you might want to worry about for other reasons. So, racial profiling would be a case where you might simply say, look, okay, this thing works. It's getting good results. It's predicting recidivism or whatever. But the way that it's doing that involves responding to features of people that we think is a totally inappropriate to use. So there'd be other grounds for contestation there.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Let me encourage people again to just put a line in the chat if you have a question. Joanne, I know you've got one more question. I might just ask one of my own and then we'll loop back to you, Joanne, in a moment.
Very good.
Rob, I want to explore the importance of the black box argument, because my suspicion is that it doesn't matter at all for the following reason. Is it a latent premise when we get all up in arms about LLMs being a black box that humans are not a black box? In other words, that our own motivations are transparent to ourselves, and what we articulate to ourselves as the reasons why we have made decisions are in fact the reasons why we have made decisions. In other words, we're not doing what we accuse the LLMs of doing. But haven't, people like Daniel Kahneman and many others show that just isn't the case. We are not transparent to ourselves, and we post hoc justify all the time. And so if that's true, what's the qualitative difference then between us spouting off various reasons for why we even genuinely may think that we have done what we have done, but may be mistaken about that, and the LLM spouting off various reasons that we suspect are really not the reasons it came to a decision, but reasonable justifications that are engineered such as, it thinks it will placate us with our demand for a reason. And the tiny little coder, if that's the case, if there really isn't much of a distinction there, isn't the major distinction here, not that it's a black box, but it's human imputability. Like I can be held, and you made this point, I can be held to account for my decisions. I can go to prison, I can be pilloried in the press, I can be hauled over the coals. And because I have interests in the world, you mentioned I have a body, I can be harmed in the world in various different ways, reputationally and otherwise. That's the difference. The LLM doesn't have any interest in the world. It can't be harmed. And therefore, it doesn't care. It has nothing to lose if it, just manufactures reasons. So is the black box a red herring, basically?
Look, I think, so you're absolutely right that people make shit up all the time, and there's lots, there's good literature now in kind of in psychology that shows that people's account, like people are they've mistaken themselves about the reasons why they've behaved the way that they do. So people do these cunning experiments involving priming, where people can't solve a problem, and they introduce a hint, and then people solve the problem, and they ask them how they solve the problem, and they don't refer to the hint, which seems to suggest that people don't know themselves why they've reached the conclusions that they have. But I think what the black box metaphor draws attention to is the importance of practices of reason giving. And the first reasons that people give for their decisions might well be made up, but through the course of the conversation, people can be required to justify what they've done. And there's something very important in terms of, what you describe as Kantian respect for the agency of others, that we are willing to provide them with reasons for our decisions. Now, again, I do think the machines fundamentally can't do that for the reasons that we've just discussed. But what that implies is that the practices of reason giving that are relevant here is the reasons that the person who put that AI in place can give for doing that. Okay, and in that context, I do think that the fact that a system is a black box need not make it impossible for someone to provide a reason for deferring to it. Okay, and again, this is just simply coming from my experience of looking at these arguments in medicine, where, if you ask the doctor, why does, this particular blood test reveal something about your chance of heart attack, maybe that people genuinely don't know the mechanism. Okay, people haven't figured out why a particular, protein or chemical system in the blood is associated with some bad outcome, but they simply know that it is, or they don't know why, if we give people this particular drug, they get better. We don't understand the biological mechanism whereby some treatments work. Nonetheless, the justification is we know people get better if we prescribe this drug. So, electroconvulsive therapy for serious depression. No one has a flipping clue why running electricity through the brain should sometimes help people recover from severe depression, but we know that it does, and that is a good justification for doing that, horrific thing. So it just seems to me possible that someone might say, yep, I don't know how this machine gets it right, but it does. And if you wanted a reason, I've given you one. And someone should feel that their Kantian agency has in fact been respected by being given that reason. Now, again, in practice, there's all sorts of reasons to be suspicious of that, because typically when people say this machine works, they're not giving you the data that shows, that they may say, oh, sorry, we can't do that because it's commercial in confidence. And it's also very hard to um, know where the edge cases are. Okay, so again, there's a medical analogy here. You might know that this medicine helps most people get better, but there's a small category of patients for whom it's disastrous. Now there's the question of, am I one of those patients? And that's much harder to answer. So there's more stuff that needs to go on here. But or like, if I tossed a coin to decide which of my kids, gets to go out, next Wednesday or something, there's a sense in which I can justify that result and a sense in which I can't. The justification is it's a fair decision procedure, tossing a coin. If my daughter says it's not fair, why did the coin come up heads? There's nothing I can say. So practices of reason giving can work at different levels. Yeah. So in that sense, I think the black box metaphor foregrounds the importance of practices of reason giving, but the presence of black box does not mean that we cannot give reasons for using that system. Yeah.
Okay. Lovely. Thank you. I will hold back my follow-up because I don't want to squeeze Joanne's question out of time. So Joanne, let me hand over to you for your next question.
Thank you. I'm wondering about the notion of time in decision making. I'm unpacking this notion of what makes the AI better than a human being. We're setting up situations in which time is the ultimate factor. For example, is perceived to be the ultimate factor. That the decision making in, let's say, a nuclear situation where someone else is shooting arms off, and where we've got arms, and the question is whether or not we should shoot our arms off. In response, we are told, in effect, that this situation can only be done by AI because humans just cannot respond that quickly. The brain may respond very, very quickly at some level, but we have all sorts of things that stop our actions so that we could not make that, be involved in that decision to the point at which it makes sense to be involved in that decision. And I'm wondering again, unpack, the general question, unpacking that, writing humans out of those decisions by the way we're framing them. And that's a particular worry for me, because we certainly, I mean, just in terms of safety and all of that, but in terms of what philosophers can do, philosophers like you can do to help us, and understanding the difficulties of taking this notion of better and setting up these contests. What I've written on in terms of my recent book on robots, we set up these contests, us against robots. It's almost like John Henry. There's a wonderful poem, John Henry, the steel man, whatever. Yeah, exactly. So thank you. I think I hope I've presented the question well enough. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Look, so there are a whole lot of kind of game theoretic situations where you can know that creating a certain structure of incentives effectively forces people to behave in a certain way. So, and sometimes the winning strategy can in fact be to make it impossible for you to make a decision. So the classic case here is the game of chicken, where two people are driving cars towards each other to crash, and the winning strategy is to put a steering wheel lock on your steering wheel. Okay, and the moment that someone does that, the other person should simply give up, because once I've made it impossible for me to swerve, that's a winning strategy. I think the way we need to respond, and certainly that kind of increasing tempo of operations, as they say in the military, is involves some pretty well-known dangers. I mean, certainly the nuclear thing is launch on warning systems are disasters in the making. It seems to me the only response there is to recognize where this stuff is heading and try to both pull back. Okay, now that's very difficult. I mean, so I've been sort of intimately involved in campaigning for arms control of military robots. I was one of the founders of a thing called the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, which is an early version of what then became the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. And one of the best, and this is something I've written a lot about, one of the best reasons to resist handing over military operations to machines is precisely that it lowers the threshold of conflict. The risk of accidental war becomes too great. But it's very, very hard to resist that short of confronting a collective action problem. This is not something, if I simply say I'm not going to embrace those systems, then I will get outcompeted by people who do. So it's a really standard collective action problem. And the solution is, trying to build a recognition on both sides of where this stuff heads if we embrace it, recognizing that it's in nobody's interests to end up in a world where, you get a kind of nuclear conflagration because there's been some mistake made by a computer. But also, that particular dilemma is not, you don't really need AI to be involved for that to be an issue. So the history of what's called launch on warning systems, which was, this idea that you would launch you couldn't wait for the enemy's missiles to land before you shot back because your command and control system would be destroyed by the initial salvo. You had to launch when the radar tells you that there's an incoming salvo of missiles. But those radar systems were historically really unreliable, and so those systems were incredibly dangerous. But people have been dealing with that since the 1960s. You don't need AI involved for that to be a problem. Though I think AI exacerbates it. Yeah, but this is a political problem, not a technological one. It seems to me. Does that make sense, Ryan?
Again, unpacking that notion of better, we may at some point need to understand and define a human scale decision, something that humans can participate in. I mean, there's a reason why we have in our legal systems in the U.S. at least, and in many other countries, the notion of bring the body in. You have to go through these steps, and with the AI apparatuses we've been talking about, the missile apparatuses, missile launch apparatuses, we don't have a human scale in effect. We have decisions on both sides if we're talking about certain types of nuclear interactions being done at AI scale, at machine scale. So again, build unpack in certain ways between us and computers, we will always lose if we frame them in certain ways. But if we frame them in other ways, in terms of how that decision making process weaves into our lives, we can have better decisions. So again, just that notion of better was kind of grating on me as I was listening to the discussions because I haven't seen it unpacked well enough. Thank you so much.
Right. Okay. So look, all sorts of reasons to be worried about metrics, all sorts of reasons to be worried about reducing a complex set of valuations to a simple set. And when people talk about better, often there are, as you are pointing out, there's a whole set of value judgments involved in that. But all that said, in some contexts, there genuinely are clear ways of evaluating which of two decision-making procedures is better or realizes a particular value. And unfortunately, in the military context, firing first ends up as being quite important. And I mean that's why the kind of those phalanx CWIS systems that I had an image of earlier, the sort of computer-controlled Gatling guns. There's if I had a choice of being on the ship that had the computer-controlled Gatling guns and being on the ship that was relying upon, dudes with machine guns to try to shoot down incoming cruise missiles, I know which ship I'd want to be on. And similarly, if the human radiographer is missing the cancers that the AI radiographer is catching, seems to me sometimes I'm just going to want the AI radiographer, or at least that we can't rule out that possibility. We can't rule out that there's just a clear kind of here's what people care about, and because they care about that, this machine, we are justified in turning to this machine. Now, all that being said, you're absolutely right. That's so often when people insist that something is better, they're trying to close down a conversation about all the different values that are involved, and the different ways in which the world might be as well.
Just a very quick follow-up. The idea of having the radiographer be a backup to the computer and having basically that's more expensive. Okay, I mean I don't want to get into the economic arguments per se, but it might be a better option than setting up this contest. We're setting up these contests with computer versus person in some naked, the person in some naked individualistic way. Whereas if we had computer versus radiographer as plus computer, we might see the situation in a more nuanced way. Again, making an obvious point. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Wonderful.
Sorry, Joan, can I say, for what it's worth, I'm actually involved in a clinical trial of an AI radiographer where it is precisely the trial at the moment is, 2 human readers versus 1 human reader and an AI. So, but it is also pretty clear that what people are going to take away from this system is that, that the machines are cheaper and better, and I don't have high hopes of having any human radiographers in that role in the future. So that's not and that's not a happy conclusion for me. But and then that is something that people need to be thinking. I guess that's your point, that people need to think about what's the long-term consequence of running a particular competition. And there's whole set of conversations you can have with the human radiographer that you can't have with the AI radiographer. There are single points of failures. You know, the AI radiographer involves a single point of failure, which is really dangerous. There's other things to be concerned about. But yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about that stuff every day at the moment.
Thank you.
Wonderful. We have sorry, Joanne, I do need to jump in. We have overrun our time, and out of respect for people who are here, I think I do need to draw proceedings to a close. The fact that we could keep going, and I certainly have more questions of my own, I think just shows what a rich and important set of questions this is, field this is, but also just how expertly, Rob, you've opened it all up for us, and you've really led us on a journey. So I'm very, very grateful indeed for your time and the generosity with which you've engaged with these questions. And I wonder if I could just finish by asking everyone just to join me in expressing our thanks in whatever electronically mediated way is appropriate to our speaker for this evening, Professor Robert Sparrow.
Cheers. There is some danger that this paper will actually be published in the not too distant future. It's had a pretty not a very happy history with review over the years, but I think I'm close to actually getting it out in a decent journal. So might there is a full written version if anyone wants to see it, and there is some chance that it might actually come out in the next couple of months. Anyway, I've very much enjoyed the conversation, and thank you all for sticking with it. Lovely to meet you all, and look forward to learning more about the network's activities in the future.
Thanks again, Rob. Take care.
No worries. Night all. Bye-bye.